Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to our March History Club with the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project. I'm going to hand you over to Kirsty Comack, who will introduce our guest. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Joe. Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome to this month's History Club hosted by the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project. And I am joined today by the lovely Marie Quiery. She has been a human rights activist for over 40 years. She was a founding member of the Lesbian Advocacy Services Initiative, since renamed as Here NI, the Belfast Unemployed Resource Centre, the Shankill Women's Centre, the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and Clár na Ban. Okay, I butchered that pronunciation. Okay, I'm very sorry to any Irish speakers in the room. Please have mercy on me. She is also the author of a number of influential reports relating to LGBTQI plus rights, including the foundational report A Mighty Silence, Invisible Women in 2005, and Guidelines for Lesbian and Bisexual Women's Health in 2010. And the subject of this evening's History Club, Irish, Queer and Equal. So, Mary, handing it over to you. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. And I think, Joe, you're not the only one over 60 here. I'm 75, so for good or ill. I shouldn't have, maybe I should have, yes, Brian, I think you're probably over 60 as well. So I'm going to talk about an event that was held in August 2000 called Irish, Queer and Equal. It was held as part of Feile and Feile. I'm just wondering, is there anybody here who was present? Yes, Gareth, I thought you would be. Yeah. So it was a packed house, but I'm going to talk a bit about Joe had asked me to talk a wee bit about the context of what it was like in the olden days. I'm still coming to terms with the fact that I'm now regarded as history, so I don't quite see myself in that way. And then I'm going to talk a wee bit about lesbian visibility at the time. And then I'll focus on the actual event, and the event which was seen by some as controversial at the time. But there's questions and issues that were raised at that event that I think are still very relevant today. And so I'll be asking for your opinions on that, whether you think it's relevant. So just in terms of myself, I suppose I've been active around issues in relation to women, and also in the kind of broad Republican landscape. I'm not party affiliated, but I do believe the future of this country lies in finishing, getting rid of colonization, which seems to, well, I let that person in, I can do that. So, that's something that I've been active over a period of time. And so in terms of bearing in mind the context at that time, and I had to go back and check, because we had very few rights, aside from decriminalisation in 1982, which I think Brian was very involved in. And he could fill us in a bit more about that, but really nothing in terms of legislative change happened until 1998, and under the Northern Ireland Act, Section 75, which encouraged local authorities and public authorities to pay attention to the rights of lesbian and gay people, and really trans rights weren't really mentioned in Section 75. Now, you couldn't actually, as an individual, you could put in a complaint, but you didn't have a legal right to go to court and say you were discriminated against. But and really, and after that, there's sexual discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment came in 1999. And still at that stage, you could be discriminated against at work you could be fired. You could, without necessarily giving you an explanation. And you couldn't complain on the grounds of your sexual orientation. And it wasn't until 2003 that employment equality regulations came into effect. And by that time, I got a lot of hassle at work because I've been out since 1977, and I got quite a hard time at work but I had no recourse, no legal recourse, and I actually left my permanent pensionable job. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to go self-employed at that time, but a lot of people weren't able to. And then our next step was in 2007, the Equality Act around sexual orientation, which covered goods, services and facilities. And Gareth could tell you a lot more about the experience of being the wrong end of that. And it wasn't until 2004 that civil partnership came in. Following that, 2013 adoption rights, that it was legally recognised that LGBT people could adopt, and 2020 brought in marriage equality. Now, part of what I'll be asking is legislation enough? But you can imagine that the absence of all of those pieces of legislation in the year 2000 meant that it was very difficult for people to be visible, because you ran the risk of losing your job. And bear in mind that under a lot of those pieces of legislation, religious organizations were exempt. So that if you, for example, were a teacher in a Catholic school, you couldn't come out, and if you did, you ran the risk in all employment which was a very common experience, of not being sent on training, not being sent to conferences, not being given the same access to promotion as straight people in the organization. So in the absence of those rights, when the peace process came along, certainly as women, and as lesbian women in particular, we felt very excluded. That if suddenly all the women disappeared off the screens and it became a sort of male-only preserve, in terms of, peace was the serious business that couldn't be trusted to women. So myself and Marie Quiery Mullen, who's here as well, she was one of the people who was involved in setting up an organisation called Clarnaman. And that was set up by a group of women who saw the future being in an all-Ireland context, and that we wanted to ensure that women's issues were being raised and being dealt with, and we were very angry at the time about how exclusive it was. Now, it was also exclusive of gay men and trans as well. So we organised a conference in Culturland in, I think, 1994. And we were badmouthed up and down the Falls Road because we were seen as being disloyal to the peace process and that we all should have been on board. But it was very successful, and there is a report on that, which I think is also available online. You can look it up. And if anybody's interested, if I think I have it, I can always send it to Joe or Kirsty, and they can, they can field it. So so when it came to Feile, we already had held I think we called it a queer Ceilidh, which there was more people turned up to watch our appalling dancing than there was who were actually participating. But it was a start. So we, at that time, you may remember that the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City, which is probably the biggest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world, had a ban on LGBT people participating in it. And so we use that as being the topic of consideration. And we had already had contact with Peace Watch Ireland, who had a policy of coming over. And if, for those of you who remember Garvaghy Road, they tended to act as observers of Orange marches and to keep an eye on how it was being policed and stuff. But they suggested that they come over on a visit. And so we used that opportunity to look at what are the issues focused on the St. Patrick's Day parade. Could you also be Irish and be, I'm going to use the term queer. I hope it at the time, even to use Irish queer and equal, as you can imagine, for a lot of people who had, that term had been a term of abuse in the 60s and 70s. For a lot of people, it was quite hard to take. But my second name being Query was like, I kind of had to embrace it. So we called it Irish Queer and Equal. And could you be fully Irish and be queer, or did you have to make a choice? And we involved the Peace Watch Ireland. We involved mainly Black queer activists who were also involved in the civil rights movement. And their experience was that when they were at meetings of Black people, they were, people didn't see queer rights as being part of the civil rights agenda. And when they were involved in queer politics, the queer community didn't view race as being an issue for them. So they spoke very eloquently. But before we go into that, I'll talk just about lesbian visibility. And at the time, and there's others on this Zoom who would be well able to talk about it, was that because there was no protection, it was still very much, I feel like, an underground movement. We did socialize a lot at the time. That up until really about 10 years ago, I was at every invention of a club scene there was for lesbian and bi women. And at that time, there was two events. One was the Juice Bar, and looking up on it, I remembered that we were not viewed as being, financially viable. So we only ever got a venue for a Thursday night, which, as you can imagine, raised issues for people going to work the next day. But there was a lot of competition, and so at that time it was called the Juice Bar, which was held in the room upstairs in the Duke of York. Ironically, that's the only job that Gerry Adams had before he was interned, was as a barman in the Duke of York. There was also Sunday Scene, which Cara Friend organised for a Sunday afternoon, because And I think this was true for gay men as well, that a lot of the social scene evolved around alcohol. And so we met in bars. We probably drank a lot. And alcohol was a big issue in the queer community at that time. So Sunday scene was seen as an alternative where you could go on a Sunday afternoon and there, people could bring their kids with them. It was more of a family event, and there wasn't any alcohol involved. And again, because I suppose because of the lack of lesbian visibility, when there was discussions around queer rights, as lesbians, we were largely on the margins. We weren't very visible. And I mean, Gareth could talk about COSO, the Coalition on Sexual Orientation, which was set up by a group of people, including Barbary Cook, which was mixed in terms of gender, but we still felt there was a gap. And in 1999, we set up Lassie, or we started discussing setting up an organisation that would specifically look at legislative change for lesbians and bisexual women. I do remember saying to one of the DUP ministers when the Assembly got going that Lassie was Ulster Scots for lesbian, and he didn't laugh. But anyway, it became Here and I then in 2012. So as part of the process of setting up Lassie, and Kirsty's mentioned it, that I was commissioned, or I tendered for the process of writing up the experience of a lesbian and bisexual woman. And, trans women were not included in that. There was really, the trans issue was still largely, at best ignored, and there was some resistance. I was very active in the trade union movement, and we had to fight very hard to get the T included in the LGB. But that's Shinske Lela, that's another story. So out of that came a report called A Mighty Silence, which I tried to make it as diverse as possible to include the experience of women from minority ethnic groups, ex-prisoners, women who would identify as loyalists, and it was very revealing. So, and I suppose one of the things about lesbian visibility is traditionally, as lesbian women at that time, certainly we would have had very strong connections with the women's movement. In fact, some would argue we actually were the women's movement, but we were never regarded as putting, your best foot forward. It was regarded as an insult to say to the women's movement, and that they were just a bunch of lesbians. So as one of the bunch of lesbians, I had to say, well, yes, and do you have a problem with that? I was the first worker in the first women's centre in Belfast, which was in Donegal Street. And that was in 1981 when I took up what was a half-time post under the ACE scheme. Anybody remember the ACE scheme? Which was to take people off the dole. Not terribly well paid, could I say. But so traditionally we would have had alliances within the women's movement, and an awful lot of the what's now called the CEOs or the directors of women's organisations were lesbian women, and a lot of them were closeted for the reasons that that I have given. And so we were, I think, a very substantial, and still are, a very substantial part of the women's movement. But again, it was, I think, the women's movement found it hard to acknowledge that, yes, there were a large number of us who were lesbian and bisexual, because that, you know, in terms of trying to get people publicly on board. But however, that is a discussion for another occasion. So in terms of the Irish Queer and Equal event, I think that as the Falls Women's Centre were also involved in it with us. And I think as women, we were at that stage very used to being on the margins. And so it was, in some respects, we were more prepared to tackle issues that would be regarded as controversial. So to challenge mainstream, if you call them that, Irish politicians, and to say, and what about in terms of, bear in mind that the peace process was still in its early days, is to challenge them around where do queer rights fit into some vision of a new Ireland, was quite challenging. And to do it, as I say, on the basis of the assumption, which now, what is it, 26 years on, is now more acceptable, that partition is going to end in some form or other. Now I would call it, rather than partition, I would talk about colonization. And we were saying earlier that really homophobia and transphobia are a legacy of colonization. And that's not just in Ireland. It was the British who in 1886, I think you said, Joe, introduced the first act that made homosexuality illegal. But when Cortes first arrived in Mexico in, what was that, 15th century, he sent back letters to Spain to say there was more than two genders in that part of the world. So transphobia and the homophobia that exists in Africa did not exist before colonization. And in Pakistan, they still have British legislation on their books in relation to homosexuality. And so, you know, that's something that I think we need to address. And that's why I personally feel that you can't campaign against homophobia without also campaigning against transphobia. And I was saying to Joe earlier, there is no word in the Irish language for lesbian or gay. Now, more recently, in the last 15 years, Eriach has been introduced, as which roughly translates as fairy. But traditionally in the Irish language, you are not othered because of your sexual orientation. And I suppose that it, in a way, the colonization, as well as backing, I suppose, the introduction of capitalism that was prepared to pillage and still is, in this, as we speak, in terms of the, you know, the US's attempt to get access to oil resources in the Middle East, and their interest there is around making money. So the reason that I mention colonization is because it has also had an impact in terms of race and how, what was a white male exploit, really, in terms of colonization, also had impacts in terms of, it was a very misogynist project, and class was a central part of that, is that inherited wealth and the fact that you passed on the power from one generation of men to another. And we know that in the queer community, that is harder to do. Most of us were reared in heterosexual families, and much as we may have loved them, and they may indeed have loved us, they weren't able to prepare us for what we had to face in terms of going out into the world and facing homophobia and transphobia. So, but research has shown, and not just research globally, but research in the north of Ireland, as you know, reveals that discrimination and bigotry in terms of misogyny and sexual orientation goes along with racism and discrimination on the grounds of class as well. So they need to be addressed and taken together. Now, I think we still have a lot to learn about it, and the Irish Queer and Equal event was about addressing that. And there was, at that stage in 2000, there was still really only the beginnings of what I would call, certainly of services for the LGBT community. It was still very grassroots. It was viewed as being quite separate to the fight for human rights in and around issues of race, of social class, and even in terms of women's rights. They were seen as being quite separate. So I feel very strongly, part of learning our history, and the History Project is a very good example of how important it is. Our history is part of the struggle for equality, because a lot of us have been in the position of reinventing the wheel, really, in terms of, fighting for legislative change. Now, a couple of strong issues came up at the Irish Queer and Equal. One was, is legislative change enough? And with legislative change, does there come a change in social attitudes? And there was, various, I must say, the Black Americans felt that there needed to be an awful lot more work done around the institutions, that the legislative change doesn't bring about necessarily changes in how government functions. And I think we've had a few examples of that, and the main one being that there is still no sexual orientation strategy from the Assembly. And Gareth and other people who are present today will have attended many meetings, including myself, to try and move that further forward. And really, there's very little momentum for it. And so in that sense, the legislative change hasn't brought about the institutionalized, I suppose, homophobia that exists within our governmental structures. So, and the other piece that came up, and Jerry Adams attended the meeting. He was going to introduce it. He was the MP for the area, and normally what would have happened during Feile would be he would come along, and we're all familiar with this from politicians, and would say a few comforting words at the beginning and then head for home. And he stayed for the full meeting and got quite a lot of criticism around the fact that he marched with the St. Patrick's Day parade. He led it off. And he argued, well, that, you know, that I think it was Kieran Rose said that you can operate in terms of moral grounds or what is actually possible. But he did apologise for that. And I suppose what occurred to me at the time was, and it changed my attitudes completely, is that we can't expect our politicians to change if they're not informed, and we need to be briefing them a lot more than I think we currently do. And, you know, as well, in addition to direct campaigns, we need to inform them about why pronouns are important, about the links between the misogyny that that is very prevalent in this part of the world. And I don't have to mention the murder of 30 women in the past number of years. That you know, that it goes along with having, you know, queer rights in terms of the LGBT community. So one of the things that became evident at that was that, and there was quite a few young people. It was a very, very diverse audience, Gareth, as you will remember. And one of the things I remember was a young lad who was, I presume he still is, was gay, and he said that he felt that the queer movement, the gay movement downtown, as he described it, had no relevance to him because it didn't take on board the infringement of his rights as an Irish Catholic living in West Belfast. And I would say that's true. At that time, there was no link between those movements. But and as you know, Brian Gilmore, who's I learned some of my history from Brian, was that the original case that was taken to the European Court in 1981 was supported by the civil rights movement. And as far as I know, the solicitor involved, who Brian can remind me of his name, gave his services free. And that kind of collaboration doesn't happen often enough. And I know for some people it would be regarded as controversial. It certainly was in the year 2000. But as an LGBT or queer community, we need to be discussing those issues. We need to be addressing them. It is our, you know, for example, our leadership. Are we doing enough to bring younger activists and working class and Black activists along? You know, is to give them support in terms of leadership. So I feel, and I felt at the time, that we needed to build bridges between social movements, and we used Feile as, you know, as I suppose as a tool to try and do that. And there isn't a reason why we can't be involved in other summer schools, Feiles, whatever festivals in East Belfast where we would raise some of these issues and offer what that event did do was offer an opportunity. And it's hard to describe to younger people listening to this that to actually go downtown in still in the late 90s was could be a scary experience, a very scary experience if you were a gay man in particular. It probably still is. It certainly is if you're trans. But that so we need to, we need to broaden out and create links between the various social movements that exist. And I feel that the way forward for ourselves is is to form more alliances, um, and create those links. And where there are difficulties with it, that we need to address those and promote discussion on it. So I feel I've probably said enough, Kirsty, at this stage, and Kirsty is now going to chair. I think, well, there's people, I'm very aware, Kirsty, that there's people on the Zoom who who were present at the event and who would certainly have opinions on.
Yes, and I'd be very, very interested in hearing about them. Like, yes, I've just been taking notes while you were talking, Mary, because you were just what you were saying was just so stimulating and just so interesting to me as a ceasefire baby, as somebody who unfortunately is quite youthful and was never around to witness all of this. But yes, so thank you again, Mary. So I'm going to open the floor in a wee minute for anyone who wants to ask questions, but I have got a few myself for you, if that's okay, Mary. So you mentioned there about how 90s, late 90s nightlife can be scary for gay people. And when I say gay, I mean lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, and even more so for trans people, unfortunately. And in my view, that hasn't changed, with the recent murders that have gone on and the 30 women that have been murdered as well. Like, not much has changed in that regard, I think. But so my question is, what did lesbian nightlife look like in Ireland or Northern Ireland at the time? And how did women and lesbians create social spaces of their own within nightlife scenes that were, quite dominated by men? How did they keep themselves safe?
Well, well, it felt like a much smaller scene that because you were,
Hmm.
and for an awful lot of people, and I think this probably applied to gay men as well. Well, I know it did, is that being out was a kind of a weekend event, that people would go to a club, and all the lesbian clubs were in bars uh, where people paid whatever it was probably about £2 in those days to go, and there would be a disco, and vast amounts of alcohol would be consumed, and it was kind of I don't think it's unfair to say that a lot of that a lot of times it would end up in somebody having a fight. When people, it was like people were living under a pressure cooker, and when they taken a bit of alcohol, it let the lid off it, and it was kind of like who are you looking at, or there was various rows. I do remember one occasion where we met quite often. Uh, there was women-only events that were organised by organisations like Women's Aid. So quite a few lesbians turned up to those. And
Mm.
women's events. I do remember one occasion, Monica McWilliams, who people may have heard of, who was, central to the Women's Coalition. And I always remember this woman was literally had another woman by the hair, was beating her head off the bonnet of a car. And, and Monica went up. I was going, oh God, Monica went up, now please, girls, would you ever back off? And I thought, Monica, you have no chance here, which she didn't have. But so there was a lot. There was, it was a very charged atmosphere. But having said that, as I said, I come from a Catholic background, and I was a founder member of the Shankill Women's Centre, and
Mm,
occasionally I would be walking up the Shankill Road or in a taxi, and I must say that the Shankill Road dykes would always give me, a nod that I would have met them on a Saturday night, and it never stretched to being a smile, but because they knew my politics, but
mm.
I always felt safer, that knowing that they were there, and if somebody did attack me, that they would have come to my defense.
Wow. Wow.
Uh,
Yes.
we
That's
didn't
really
talk about it
interesting.
at the time. It's only been as it has become safer. People, well, I think particularly in the queer community, people have opened up a bit more. People,
Hmm.
it's a bit easier to come out and and I have talked to the Shankill Road dykes now who used to be so intimidating looking, and now, like myself, they've all shrunk a bit and have all got white hair and all the rest of it, don't look quite as intimidating.
So it was kind of like an unspoken agreement that you all protect each other.
I think yes, there was, and it wasn't safe
Mm,
enough to really to hold conversations about the broader politic.
mm.
There may be
Yeah.
other people who in on the Zoom who would disagree with me. I'd be interested to know
Hmm.
what that
Well,
would.
I've got a loads of questions, but unfortunately, because of time, I can't ask them all. But I'll ask you one more question, and then I will open up the floor to folks in the chat. Um, so you mentioned about Clarnaban. I hope I pronounced that right. But and how they were rooted in this sense of frustration at how women were being excluded from what is basically a monumental peace process. Um, but lesbian and bisexual women didn't always fit neatly within that Republican framework or that feminist structure. So how do you know how did these queer women negotiate this? Where did they find companionship in those overlapping sort of identities?
Well, there was quite, I think I mentioned in A Mighty Silence, I got to speak to a lot of uh, lesbian ex-prisoners, Republican
Mm,
ex-prisoners. I didn't find any. I did speak to loyalist lesbians, but none of them had the experience of being in jail. And they found that within the jails, and there was certain acceptance within the communities, but there was still a sense that if you were putting your best foot forward, you wouldn't put a lesbian, to meet the Americans, for example.
mm,
But
okay.
there's a lot of solidarity, but still, uh, I mean, given that those women wouldn't have accessed any services, uh, downtown, for example. I don't know, Mary Ellen might have something to
Yeah.
contribute to that, but that was
Well,
my experience. And I think for women in any political party, and it has annoyed me, could I say, may as well get it all out while I've got the chance. But
you're in a safe space, Mary. Go ahead.
well, I don't know about that, but that when people talk about women's contribution to the peace process, they only ever refer to the Women's Coalition, and
Mm,
that women within the Republican movement did a lot to change attitudes. And I suppose that was at that first Clarnaman conference. That anger came out because those women had worked so hard around all the issues, as well as holding families together. that they had, organised the support for the dirty protests, for the hunger strikes, and really, when push came to shove, and I will admit that the media, which was also full of closeted gay men, and who that they were quite happy to sit and talk to a group of men and would never consider that they should give women a voice. So that was true. I think it's probably true of a lot of political parties still, but
I think it's still true today, but yeah, there you go. That's my controversial take. But yes, thank you so much, Mari. Thank you so much for answering my questions. So has anyone got any questions in the chat for Mari? If you don't want to speak, that's fine. Just put your question in the chat and I'll read it out. Otherwise, please put your hand up or please speak freely. Speak now, forever hold your peace.
Kirsty Eddie's trying to get in.
Oh, Eddie. Oh yes, ask to unmute.
Okay.
There we go. Having trouble with technology, but there you go.
Oh, I'm the same. I want to ask a question, and we all know what's going on at the minute. And it's difficult for a lot of people to get through with worrying and everything else. And I want to ask the question. Now, I don't have any trans friends, but totally support them. Now, why are trans people literally getting a hammering at the moment? In the south of Ireland, Republic of Ireland, whatever you want to call it, okay? I watch there's two YouTubers, they're quite popular, but they're always giving trans people a hammering. Not saying a lot, but mentioning them, two in particular, okay? Now, even the Pope this week has given trans people a hammering. Like, we know what trans is all about and why they are trans. But I can't believe the level of education that they have, that they can't find out about trans people. They don't know about trans people. Even us, LGBTQIA, we have got the same this week. Like, why are we all getting a literal hammering at the moment under the circumstances that is going on at the minute? I don't understand, and I want to ask.
well, I mean, I think that's probably a question for everybody, but I will say I went to a talk given by Sean Feile, who's a trans woman who's English, and she was asked about how come there was what are commonly known as TERFs, how come that movement was so strong in England and less so here. And she said it's because white British feminists have never accepted their role within colonization. So that's what I think, that both trans as a notion which has existed all over the world, as you know. So is it Joe or is it Eddie?
It's Eddie.
Eddie.
It's me.
Eddie, as you know, the trans communities exist all over the world, but it is as gay men and lesbians are, they are a threat to what would be seen as, I suppose, the values of capitalism.
Okay.
But in terms of, so for example, how you decide wealth is inherited and passed on, it is extremely important.
Yes. I just can't. I can't even get a. Of course I got on the keyboards and I asked them to explain this, and and they didn't reply to me, and I sort of outed them on their. This is quite a phrase. I outed them on the YouTube, their YouTube. What would you call it? Their YouTube page, as they were talking, and they didn't answer. and no one else answered. And I was quite upset about it. And then, lo and behold, the Pope, he gives his €5 worth as well, and Trump. And I just feel that what is going on? Why the trans people, under the circumstances, is getting a hammering, and it is a hammering. I can't understand it. And gay people, like, leave us alone. We're nothing to do with all of this. Like, leave us alone. And they're not going to let us leave like, life is difficult at the moment. And I don't care if this goes on YouTube or whatever. We've got all the different races coming in, religious coming in. We've got Muslims coming in, and like, all of these people are coming in. We don't know who they are, and I'm not going to go down that road. But then they
Ireland has
bring,
always had waves of migration.
okay,
So this is, and to be honest, I think it's very healthy for our genes pool to have, immigration. The population in the north of Ireland is dropping. We need migrant workers. We need people to
what
build.
about the ones who don't want to work, who are just economic migrants,
We're
who
drifting a
are
wee bit
seeking the
away from
money?
Irish queer and equal, Eddie, but because that's
I
not
know, but it's in Ireland here. It's a very big. I'm not there, but it's a very big thing in the Irish economy. And I'm trying to keep everything around Ireland as well. The two YouTubers, they started, and they're based in the south of Ireland. They're very big, and they are constantly giving jibes about trans people, and that's what brought me on to
I
this.
suggest they survive on the basis of the number of people who tune into them, and I suggest that you don't you vote with your feet and do not give them that support. But anyway, I'd
Yeah.
like to come back
Anyway,
to
Thanks very much. Thank you.
some very passionate points being made here, and I'm sorry. I would love for you to talk more, but we're kind of running short on time. So, Mary Ellen, you had your hand up there.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yeah, Eddie, I was going to suggest the same thing that Mari suggested, that don't be giving these YouTube people the time of day, because every time you
I
chat
agree.
to them or you watch them, you're actually giving them money. You're monetizing their feed. You know, that's just on that point. Mari, I was going to just go back to what you'd said earlier about the Women's Coalition. And
Yes.
I'm not saying that they didn't do good stuff. That's not my point here. But I also always get annoyed when people talk about women in the peace process, that they only
Yes.
talk about the Women's Coalition, and not anyone else. I know quite a lot of women who were involved, not only on the ground, encouraging change, from a
Yes.
Republican or nationalist background, but also women who were involved in the negotiation team, like Barbara DePrune, Lucilita Bratnack, Siobhan O'Hanlon, Michelle Gildernew, just to name four, of the kind of more frontline ones. But there was other people who are like, oh my goodness, her name just slipped me, from Dublin. But there's quite a lot of Republican women. I also know that there was women involved with the SDLP who were involved in the negotiations. Bridge, whose surname I has lost me, from Armagh. She was an MLA and minister, I believe, up in Stormont for a while. But there was quite a lot of women involved in other parties. And it is something that always annoys me when people talk about women in the kind of peace process, that they only talk about the Women's Coalition. I didn't attend this conference. I actually attended the conference that was held up in the school on the White Rock, and that would have been around about 1994. And I can't remember if it was a run on from this conference, but it was organised by Clarnaman. And Marie from the New Lodge spoke at it.
Holland, yeah.
Marie Mulholland spoke at that one. And it was kind of things too that at that time she did challenge. She challenged about visibility. and she challenged about visibility for lesbian and bisexual women within the community. And it is something that I always would ask too, as Republicans, I know quite a lot of people who aren't out, and I always question, well, why is that? Why do we not make people feel comfortable enough to be themselves? Is it something we're doing wrong? Is it society in general? Is it still the influence of Catholic churches within some families? I don't know. But I found what you were saying very interesting, and I apologise for being 15 minutes late. I had to walk the dog, who's nice snoring in the
You've got to
background.
get your priorities right, Mary Ellen.
Yeah, yeah.
What
The
actually
dog
happened
first.
to me was somebody stopped me up the street and kept me talking, and I kept saying, "Look, I have to go to a wee meeting here." So thanks
Yes,
very much. And can I just say too, and Joe, Kirsty, I apologise for jumping in, but today is Trans Day of Visibility. Um, I think it's really important that we stand with our trans community, not just in days like this, but every day of the week.
always,
Wow.
always, Mary Ellen, always.
Yeah, and I suppose really just following on from what you've said, Marielle and Eddie, is that we need our education system doesn't inform people about any of these issues, and the DUP are talking about now changing the curriculum, and it's not going to be for for the better. And I have done research into how schools view the equality agenda, and really in terms of relationship and sex education, quite often they bring in evangelical Christians to do that job. And so not a bit of wonder people come out with very skewed ideas. And I know that as a community, we're trying to change that, but it's still difficult. But do you think those issues, Kirsty, just to say, do you think those issues are still relevant? I mean, my hobby horse is that we're going through a period of enormous change in Ireland, and as a queer community, are we walking blindly into a new structure without saying what we think, what changes we want, or is marriage equality and legislative change enough for us?
Well, that's a good question, Mary. Just before I answer your question, though, are there any more questions in the chat? I know Lorraine has put in just a wee chat, a wee thing here about a lot of homophobia and transphobia started from the Reform and MAGA movement. Yes, they feel emboldened now to be loud online. Yes, that is very true, Lorraine. The internet, everyone's anonymous on the internet. Everyone thinks they're an expert too, especially when you're anonymous. Yes, everybody feels emboldened. Yeah, I agree with this. So are there any more questions in the chat?
I think Gareth has a question.
Yeah, I can't see if anybody has their hands up. So
Gareth he's down as a Zoom user and he's on mute. So
he's on mute.
Yeah.
Why is it
Oh,
Joe?
I think, yeah, it's just a
Joe,
wee thing popped up
engineer
there.
Joe.
Thank you. I didn't know how to unmute myself.
Oh, there we go.
It's not a question. It's mainly a comment on the Irish Queer and Equal up in the Culture Land. Personally, it was a very formative event for me because it was the first time I grew up in Tyrone and I'd recently moved to Belfast, and it was the first time I was in the Falls, and I was along with people from Queer Space at the time, and it was incredible. And I remember Jerry Adams saying about making a comment about the progress that we'd made, think that we were in a Presbyterian church talking about queer issues in this day and age. And I didn't have the courage to say it would have been even better if it was a working Presbyterian church. I didn't have the courage to say that, but that's what I was thinking at the time. But it was incredible. And some of the American people that were over I'm still friends with one of them, George Walker. Many years later, we're still in touch. So it was a really good time. But in terms of the politics and in terms of the the event and the activism, it's really broadened my outlook on life. So good
Oh,
work.
brilliant. Brilliant. So any other questions? I'll give it a few more
Yep.
minutes.
Yes, I
Right.
have a wee
Go ahead, Joe.
question. Just for Marie, when she was talking about the people getting sacked and things if they came from work, and that gap between decriminalization and the equality legislation was so long. Um, and I have heard of women it being used against women in terms of custody cases where they were fighting for custody of their children and the fact that they were lesbian. Mary, do you recall hearing any cases at the time of
Yes.
that? Yep.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking. I mean, and I was, as I said, I was the first worker in the first women's centre, and it was kind of boldly called itself an advice centre. Well, really, I didn't have any qualifications in terms of advice, but women did come to me, and I could manage to find sympathetic solicitors, but a lot of women didn't challenge it, and that is lost in our history. And I was interviewed by a young lad who was doing a doctorate or something, and I said those women who lost custody of their children have never been acknowledged, and whatever about losing your job, there is nothing that can compensate for that. And he said my aunt was one of those, and she lost custody of her children, and she just moved to England. Uh, totally heartbroken. Now, but I am pleased to say that one woman who did challenge it with a good solicitor did. I also saw one of the early cases where she won on the basis, that, her husband was fighting for, her ex-husband was fighting for custody of the kids. But, Joe, in terms of, and I don't know how we could write up the history of those women, because it was absolutely appalling. And another group who we don't hear much about are the women who lost their jobs in social services following the Kincora total, scandal, which is still being covered up. And they were, if any child put in a complaint against them, and usually it was a teenager who wasn't out herself and who made an accusation against a member of staff. And so their choice was to take a case, in which case they would be outing themselves. And so they could have lost their job anyway. But yes, women losing custody of their kids and that's going to be unfortunately buried in history.
Absolutely. And if you know anybody who's willing to come and speak on our podcast, we're keen to capture those kind of oral histories of everyone, and particularly women who that has happened to. So everyone, spread the word. We're here to capture those stories before we lose them in the mists of time.
Okay, folks. I think, Joe, should we finish the recording now? Or if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to send them after the recording. But thank you all so much